Hey everybody, so this is another informal video about skills to manage personal conflicts. This is a really important topic. They've done a lot of research about what are the things that make people happy. Is it money? Is it success in your career? Is it health? All these things are important and they actually add to your material happiness. But actually, the main thing that makes people happy is connection with other people. And it's actually very closely related to the longevity of your life. And so the quality of your relationships has a huge impact on your life in so many ways because everything actually in life is dependent and about interacting with other people. We can't live on our own unless it's a very primitive existence. And so it's really worth investing in developing your skills in communication and empathy. And what time is it more difficult than when you're managing personal conflicts with other people? And so I'm going to draw on some of my favorite books today. So, number one, oh, you can't see that. Let me see if I can make it so you can see it. Okay, here we go. Nonviolent Communication. I love this book. Number two, Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. Love this book. He's a former FBI hostage negotiator, and he uses the same empathy tactics to deal with adversaries or people who aren't necessarily on your side, but are still human beings. And Super Communicators by Charles Duhigg. This one really upped my conversational skills. And so I love these books. I practically got them memorized, and they've helped me so many times, especially in really difficult conversations. I really try to slow down and lean heavily on these skills. And I've also kind of made them my own over the years. I've adapted them to my style and personality, and just found ways to make them a lot more fluid, especially nonviolent communication. And so that's a little bit of what I want to share with you today. But just to start, I mean, where do misunderstandings come from? Because there's a difference between agreeing to disagree and the kind of just fundamental distrust and misunderstanding and contempt that we see a lot in the world and in marriages and in families and communities. And it really tears people apart, and it's really unfortunate. We live in a age where we're so hungry for entertainment that everything's become a kind of show, and it's like we're not really trying to connect with each other. So maybe you get a few clicks that way, maybe you get attention, maybe you even get power, but you can't really get connection. Did I say that, connection? So maybe you can get clicks and maybe you can get power, but you can't get connection, and you can't get trusting relationships based on real trust, which is like the most important thing in your whole life, to have relationships based on trust. And so let's talk about what happens that creates this huge chasm and divide between people. I like to call it the ladder of misunderstanding, because we're all living in the same world. So you would think that we'd be able to relate to each other. But sometimes it just feels like we're living in completely different planets and we can't see eye to eye about anything. So, how does that happen? Well, every individual is an individual with their own perspective and way of seeing things, their own desires, feelings, and way of doing things. And so, the first thing to understand in any conflict is that you might be focused on one thing while they're focused on something else. And so, even though we live in the same world, we're focusing on different parts of it. And so, that's like the first rung on the ladder. We're focused on different stuff. What's the next rung in the ladder? we interpret things in different ways. And so what you think is good, I think is bad. What I think is bad, you think is good. And we use a lot of loaded language where we're calling people names, we're characterizing them in a certain way that justifies the way we want to treat them or the way we want to speak about them. We use insults and accusations and insinuations, and this can be a huge source of conflict. And so, once we get up to that kind of loaded language and rhetoric, then it's like we're on that second rung of the ladder and we're further and further away from that shared ground, from that mutual ground where we can see, to understand each other's perspective. Even if we don't agree with each other, at least understand how the other person got there. What's the next rung in the ladder? We all have different wishes. We want to avoid some things and we want to get other things. And it's different for everyone. So the more we get absorbed in our own agenda and unwilling to acknowledge anyone else's wishes, we get further up on that ladder and we have different emotional reactions to things, which can intensify and turn up the heat on our conflicts. And then, even if at the end of the day, we're all trying to do the same things, avoid what we're afraid of, find love, find success, find happiness, we all have different beliefs and different strategies to get there. And sometimes we're so focused on each other's strategies that we don't really understand what's the other person really trying to get out of that way of living, that way of speaking. And so the more that we're just self absorbed and making assumptions about other people and not listening, we get further and further up on these ladders of misunderstanding. And then we're just both standing on our ladders yelling at each other. And there's just no chance of connecting from our two ladders. Like you can't climb from one ladder onto the other one. We got to come down, find some common ground. And that happens through empathy and controlling your own speech to communicate in a way where you really focus on what's actually important. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. Actually, the main skills that I really advocate for in your communication development is what I call 3D listening and controlled speech. Controlled speech. So let's start with 3D listening. What's 3D listening? Well, let me contrast it with 2D listening. When you have a 2D character, they're very simple. It's like the story where you have the good guy and the bad guy, and the good guy's all good and the bad guy's all bad. And so, a lot of times, we like to characterize other people in a very simple way so that we can, it justifies treating them or thinking of them the way that we want to. But everyone's got so much going on under the surface, and they've got different ways they relate to other people. They've got a whole story, they've got different episodes of their life. Anyone you really take the time to get to know, you'll realize that you can't simplify them down to they're just good or they're bad. They're just whatever stereotype you want to call them, whatever label you want to put on them. People are more than that. Maybe they are that thing in some aspect, but they're also more than that. And they're also their own version of that, right? And so 3D listening is when you're not just seeing other people and hearing them through the filter of your own preconceived judgments, but you're willing to consider there might be something you don't understand, and you approach people with a spirit of curiosity and compassion. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everyone. It doesn't mean you have to validate everything that everyone says. It doesn't mean you have to let them cross your boundaries or uh, set the tone, force you into any agreements that you don't want to agree to. It's just about understanding other people on a deeper level. And it takes a willingness and an interest. But it's so important to develop healthy relationships. Because even if you find out you don't want to be close with this person, what better way to find out than really listening to them? Because then you really get to know what's going on under the surface and you'll be more informed and deciding what kind of relationship you want to have with them or not at all. And so, just like Chris Voss, he was a FBI hostage negotiator. He was using empathy skills on kidnappers and terrorists from foreign countries, and he never intended to have any kind of relationship with them. But what he found was he was able to get so much further in having them cooperate and having them come out without hurting anybody and having them release hostages and all that kind of stuff just by showing empathy and understanding. Just by saying, yeah, you know, I understand how you see our country, how we've done this to you and that to you, and this year we did this, and he'd go through the whole history. He was speaking to someone in the Philippines who had kidnapped some Americans, and he said, our country did this to you, and they did that to you, and he went through the whole thing, and at the end, the guy said, "That's right." And just by feeling understood, that kidnapper began to lose his resentment and his anger, and he ended up releasing the Americans. And so giving people understanding, it's like it's such a small concession because you're not really giving them anything. You're just understanding them. You don't even have to agree. You don't even have to validate. You just have to show that you understand their perspective. And it's so powerful. Whether it's someone that's an adversary, like I was talking about with Chris Voss, or your spouse, someone you're close with. Maybe you have an ongoing argument that you just can't resolve. It's just like a fundamental difference and disagreement. But even if you can't come over to their side, if you can just show that you understand it, that can have a huge effect in uh, taking taking the fuel out of the fighting and bring some peace to the relationship. So 3D listening, understanding that people are complex characters, they have stories, they're real persons, and just being willing to listen or at least consider that there's more underneath the surface that you're not seeing. And then controlling your speech. This is really important. Sometimes we get into these tit for tat fights with people and we say, well, I'll stop when they stop. But you're really putting yourself in a vulnerable position for just miserable interactions by making your actions determined by what they do, what they say. You're not really taking power over yourself, over your own life. And so you got to take responsibility for your own communication. And that's where we get some great advice from Charles Duhigg. He says researchers have looked into what keeps relationships, especially marriages, afloat over the long term. And they looked at all the things they thought it would be, like using listening skills, like I've been talking about, all these things. But they found it something more fundamental. It's when you focus on what you can control, which is what you say, the time and place that you speak, the limits of what you're willing to talk about with the other person, the environment, all these things you can control. And so when you focus on those things, you can become like a collaborator with the person that you're having a conflict with, where you try to find a common ground of like, okay, well, let's focus on this issue first before we go over to this thing. Let's talk tomorrow when we're not so tired and angry, you know? Um, or you feel like saying something out of anger and you control yourself and you say, you know what, this isn't a good time for me to talk. I will get back to you tomorrow. So the more that you focus on things you can control, the more successful you'll be, the more you'll be situated in your own power. What we want to avoid is trying to control the other person because everyone has their own autonomy, their own free will. And we we hate having other people impede on our free will, even if it means we're doing something that's knowingly bad for us. That's even if we are willing. Sorry. Okay. What I mean is we're willing to even damage ourselves to prove our autonomy. When India was trying to get independence from the British said, "Well, you don't deserve independence because you can't actually handle it. Your country will be badly affected by this." And Gandhi came back and he said, "We want the right to wrong. We want the right to screw up our own country. We don't care what's going to happen. We want independence." And that's really the human spirit. And so the more that we try to control other people, even if you're right, it just takes things in a bad direction and creates a lot of bad will between you and other people. And so it's good to always respect other people's rights to make their own choices. And if you don't like the choices they're making, then take a step back and say, look, I'm willing to have this conversation with you under these terms. Otherwise, I'm not going to engage. And in that way, you're focusing on what's in your own control. And if you do this in your personal relationships, then you get to decide the tone of your interactions and your relationships, and it just empowers you and saves you from so much trouble and headache and suffering and drama that comes from trying to control each other. So, I want to go over some skills from nonviolent communication. Sometimes people use nonviolent communication in a really mechanical way. And so they'll start talking in like a formula. Like, for example, when you eat all of the cookies in the drawer, I feel angry because I have a need for sweets. Would you please not eat all the cookies without asking me? And it becomes almost like a monologue and like this strange formula, and people realize that you're doing something kind of weird. And so while that's a great place to start, I personally like to extract the principles from nonviolent communication and then use those principles to inform how I choose my words and how I listen, especially during difficult conversations. These skills have helped me so much and made such a huge difference in some of the most important conversations of my life. And that's why I've memorized this stuff. And like I said earlier, whenever I'm in a difficult, sensitive conversation, I make a point to slow down and really make sure that I'm leaning heavily on these skills. And so that's why I want to share this with you. So, number one, you have to understand the difference between observations and evaluations. So, observation is simply describing objectively what you see or hear, whatever a camera could notice, because a camera doesn't make judgments about anything. It just captures sounds and captures sights. And so whenever we have a conversation about something, we want to bring something up, then the first question is, what's this really about? Right? What's this conversation really about? That's usually the first thing we're trying to figure out in any conversation. What's this really about? Maybe it's about one thing for you and it's about another thing for me. And we have to kind of negotiate what's the thing we're going to focus on in this conversation. But where this really breaks down, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is how we describe things. If you describe things in an objective way, then other people are simply informed about what it is you're concerned about. If you say, for example, when you arrived 10 minutes after we agreed to meet, I want to talk about how you arrived 10 minutes after we agreed to meet today, right? It's just objective. They can kind of get some sense of how you feel about it. But it's way different from saying, yeah, I'd like to talk about how you absolutely disrespected me like a total flake. As soon as we start throwing in that kind of inflammatory language, people are no longer concerned with the facts and situation and events that we're bringing up, but they're reacting to the insulting words that we're using. And all of a sudden, the argument becomes, I'm not flaky, you're just uptight. I'm not uptight. You said you'd be here, and you are always doing this because you're just lazy. And this way, we can start attacking each other, and no one's winning. You might feel like, oh, yeah, I got them better. I insulted them more. I humiliated them. But apart from our egos, that is not going to make us happy. That's not going to fulfill our needs for trust and love and respect. And we just got to be honest with ourselves that without relationships that have those things, our life is lonely and bleak. And I just say that because I know that maybe some of you listening have some resistance to this. But I encourage you to go a little bit deeper to see where is your anger really coming from and what is it really about? What are you actually afraid of that you don't want to admit that you hide behind anger? What are you sad about? That deeper thing is actually about the desire to be loved and to love in a trusting relationship based on respect. And when we don't get that, that's when we get jaded and cynical and guarded, and we start hiding behind our egos and our insults and our blaming and victim mentality. And so when I get into arguments, why does it seem like other people live in a totally different world? It's because we're getting one step up on that ladder, and we're describing things in a way that is insulting to the other person. And so rather than them simply understanding the thing we want to talk about, they're reacting to the way that we portray things. So don't portray things in a way totally unnecessarily that only inflames the conversation. It's really important. Number 2 out of 4, self-expression versus characterization. And so, say you bring up your friend being late. Now, there's a difference between saying, I feel disappointed because I was hoping that you would want to be here. And I'm wondering now, do you want to be here or not? Were you late because you're not very interested? Or it was just traffic? I'd really like to know. So that's a self-expression, or you could say, I feel really stressed because I have a really tight schedule. And so when things start getting late, it throws everything off of my day. And so I know this is about my schedule and not yours, but I would really appreciate it if you're going to be late just to let me know next time. Right. So in this way, you're making I statements. You're making statements about how you feel, about what you want, about your schedule. And that's really different from you statements where you're characterizing the other person and telling them what they're doing to you. So you're insulting me, you're disrespecting me, you're wasting my time. The more that we start telling other people what we think they're doing to us, the more they're going to get defensive and no one's going to get their needs met. But when you simply make a statement about yourself, it at least gives the other person the opportunity to empathize and care about your feelings and try to change their behavior in a reconciliatory way. So that's really important. And this is a really, I have this question here, the real question, how do we feel? It's really important to acknowledge the emotions in the conversation because sometimes we express our emotions through how we portray things rather than saying, I feel angry. So rather than saying, I feel angry, we say, you are such an idiot and you did this and you did that. And so with our 3D listening ears, sometimes we have to try to understand what are the emotions the other person's feeling on the inside when they're saying what they're saying, and acknowledge those. And we also need to express our feelings rather than characterizing other people or the situation so that other people can connect with us as human beings. Number three, values versus strategies. How can I prevent the conversation from devolving into petty fights about things that don't really matter? And so, resolving conflicts really takes creativity. Um, because if we're really rigidly attached to the way we want to do things, it's so hard to find a solution that works for everyone, at least somewhat. And that's why this book is titled Never Split the Difference, you know? He uses the analogy like if you like the blue shoes and I like the brown shoes, should we just split the difference and get one brown and one blue? You know, if you just split the external strategy in half, you can get some really awkward outcomes. And so, what's important in creatively resolving your conflicts is to understand the purpose behind different people's ideas. And so, when a person says, "Oh, I want to do this and this and this," what you should try to understand and ask about is what purpose are they hoping to fulfill through doing that? You know, so maybe you say, "I want to go out to a dinner at the Italian restaurant," and the other person wants Italian, and then you want Mexican. Mexican tacos for a lunch at the beach. You know, and so you ask the other person, "Oh, okay, so you were thinking about Italian in the evening. Tell me more about your idea." And they tell you a little bit more, and you're trying to sense like what was the purpose and what would a successful night look like for you. And you start asking deeper questions to kind of get under the surface a little bit, and maybe you realize that they were hoping to find a romantic connection with you, and that was their particular way of doing that. And then maybe you still don't want Italian, but you can find a way to get that romantic connection, and maybe have Mexican food, right? And so the more that we can understand the purpose behind people's ideas or the way they want to do things or what they're asking for, as well as your own ideas, the more room there is to be creative in finding ways to meet both people's needs. It's not always possible to meet both people's needs, but it's most likely if you can get to the underlying values or needs or purpose behind it. And so it's really important in any conflict to try to get to the heart of the matter to understand what do I want and what do you want? Not just what we say we want, but what are we hoping to get out of the particular strategies we propose for, how we do things? What do we really want from those things? And so what we're really talking about is not any specifics in the world of, I want to do this with this person at this time at this place, but what kind of internal emotional experience are we trying to have through that experience? And there's just more avenues when you're willing to get to the heart of the matter to fulfill those needs than if you just focus on the strategies. And number four, lastly, requests versus demands. How can I express what I want without being needy or controlling? And so this is really important. It's really about having the right attitude, where you're open to other people meeting your needs, doing what you want, connecting with you, but you're not demanding it, right? And so the best way to do this is to be open to more than one person or way of meeting your needs. So, for example, if you feel lonely and you think your partner is the only person who can resolve that feeling, you're going to put a lot of pressure on them. And you're going to be needy and controlling. And then it becomes distasteful for the other person because they don't feel like they're giving willingly. They feel like they're constantly being pulled from. it sours the relationship. But if you say, okay, yeah, I do feel lonely sometimes, and I can get some connection from my spouse, but I can also connect with friends. I can also connect with community. I can do community service. I can start a hobby. I can go to the park. I can talk to people at the grocery store. There are lots of ways to find connection with other people. I can work on my social skills, my communication skills. And then you're finding different ways to meet your needs. They don't all fall on one person where you're demanding, like, you need to meet my needs. And you have to do it in this particular way. And so we want to develop that healthy balance where we're open to other people meeting our needs, but we're not demanding anything from them. And try to find relationships where it's like that from the other person too. And that's actually where you can find a lot of really sweet intimacy and connection because you're getting to know each other on a deeper level. There's trust. You really understand each other's love language, and reciprocating in those ways, it feels very voluntary and unforced. And that kind of relationship is really sweet and worth pursuing, especially with your spouse. And so these are some of the skills, especially from nonviolent communication, but also from super communicators and Never Split the Difference. I love these books. I really recommend you read them, memorize them, use these skills because they will enrich your life so much. And so I hope this video was helpful for you. If you would like help with developing any of these skills, implementing them in difficult relationships or interactions, just send me a message and I'll be happy to talk with you. Thank you. Take care.